An atomic bomb is not an expensive bomb. That's the mistake almost everyone makes. The device itself, the metal core, the explosives wrapped around it, is the last and smallest line on the invoice. What you're really paying for is a mine, a power plant that drinks a city's worth of electricity, a laboratory, and a town that appears on no map. The bomb is cheap. The economy behind it is not. Hold that idea for a second, because it runs against everything the movies taught you. We picture the bomb as a single object, a sphere, a flash, a thing you could, in theory, put on a table and point at. And so we assume the cost lives inside that object, that somewhere in the metal and the wiring there's a number, and the number is enormous. But the object is the end of a very long sentence, and almost none of the money is in the last word. So here's what I want to do. I want to follow the money, not the fear, not the mushroom cloud, the money from the moment a government decides it wants this thing, all the way down to the workers who never knew what they were building. I want to show you where every dollar actually went, because the answer tells you something the explosion never could. It tells you that a nuclear weapon isn't a product at all. It's the visible tip of an entire hidden economy, one that has to be built before the weapon can even exist. And once you see that economy, the last question, the real question, stops being how do you build a bomb, and becomes something much stranger. What exactly are you paying for when you own one? Let's start where the story usually starts. And then let's find out why that's the wrong place. Close your eyes and imagine the Manhattan Project, and you'll almost certainly imagine a room, a chalkboard covered in equations, a handful of brilliant men, sleeves rolled up, arguing about physics in the desert. The story we tell about the bomb is a story about genius, about a small circle of extraordinary minds who thought their way to the edge of the universe and came back with fire. It's a flattering story. It's also, economically, a lie of proportion. Because when we explain the bomb through genius, we're doing the same thing we do when we explain a lone inventor in a garage. We're crediting the idea and quietly ignoring the factory. And the bomb was almost entirely factory. Here's the part that gets left out. The physics, the actual theoretical breakthrough, the understanding that splitting certain heavy atoms releases staggering energy was not a secret anybody could hoard. By the start of the 1940s, that knowledge was, in the deepest sense, public. Physicists in Berlin knew it, physicists in Tokyo knew it, physicists in Moscow knew it. The equations did not belong to one country. If the bomb had been a problem of pure intelligence, half a dozen nations were standing at the same chalkboard at the same time. So the interesting question was never can we understand it. Everyone understood it. The interesting question was, can we afford to build the thing the understanding requires? And that is not a physics question. That is an industrial question, a question of minds and machines and megawatts and manpower. It's an economics question wearing a lab coat. This is the reframing the whole story turns on, so let me say it plainly. The bomb was not discovered into existence. It was manufactured into existence. The chalkboard told you the destination. It said nothing about the cost of the road. And the road, it turned out, was the entire journey. Somebody had to pay for it, not in insight, but in dollars, in electricity, in silver, and in the labor of people who would spend years of their lives on a project they were forbidden to understand. That road is where we're going next, down into the ground, to the one thing all the genius in the world couldn't conjure out of thin air. Every atomic weapon in history has been built around a single, stubborn bottleneck. Not the design, not the science, the material. You cannot make this kind of bomb out of ordinary matter. You need a very specific ingredient, a particular version of uranium, or a man-made metal called plutonium in nature. Frustratingly, hides it. In a chunk of natural uranium pulled from a mine, the useful part, the isotope that will actually sustain a chain reaction, makes up less than 1% of what you're holding, roughly 7 atoms in 1,000. All the rest is nearly identical. Nearly useless dead weight, the same element, almost the same atom, just a hair heavier. Sit with how brutal that is as an engineering problem. You are not trying to find a needle in a haystack. You are trying to separate two needles from each other when they are the same shape, the same color, the same metal, and differ only by a whisper of weight. And you need to do it not once, but across kilograms, trillions upon trillions of atoms sorted, essentially, one distinction at a time. That is where the money went. Not into the bomb, into the sorting. To do it, the United States built a facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that had no real precedent on Earth. One of the methods there used gigantic magnets to fling atoms in a curve and let the heavier ones drift a fraction wider than the lighter ones, physically peeling one isotope away from the other by brute electromagnetic force. Those magnets needed enormous coils of conductive metal. The obvious choice was copper, but it was wartime, and copper was rationed to the last ton for shell casings and wiring. So the government reached for the only other thing that would carry the current. It went to the vault. In 1943, the Manhattan Project quietly borrowed roughly 14,700 tons of pure silver from the United States Treasury silver, worth on the order of $300 million, and wound it into the magnets. Not spent, borrowed. A nation at war pulled the actual bullion out of its reserves, melted the idea of money down into wire, and used it to sort atoms one heavier than the other at a time. When it was over, most of the silver was scrupulously scraped back out and returned, counted to a fraction of a percent. That single detail tells you everything about what this project really was. It was not a laboratory. It was a mint running in reverse, turning treasure into the capacity to separate matter itself. And even within Oak Ridge, the country hedged against itself. Alongside the magnets, the same site raised a second, wholly different separation plant, a gaseous diffusion facility built around forcing uranium gas through mile after mile of microscopic filters, housed in a structure so vast it was among the largest buildings on Earth the day it went up. Two incompatible methods, side by side, sorting the same atom, because certainty was worth more than efficiency. The country wasn't buying the cheapest road to the material. It was buying every road at once, so that at least one of them would arrive in time. And Oak Ridge was only one destination. Hundreds of miles away, at Hanford in Washington state, an entirely different industrial city was raised to breed plutonium in the world's first full-scale nuclear reactors, a third parallel, equally colossal bet, because no one was certain which path would deliver first, so the country simply paid for all of them at once. Follow the dollars and the shape of the whole thing appears. The overwhelming majority of the project's budget, on the order of 80%, went not to designing a weapon, but to these factories, whose only product was a few kilograms of the right kind of metal. The bomb was waiting at the end of the assembly line. The assembly line was the war. An economy is not just money and machines, it's people. And this is where the hidden economy becomes almost unbelievable. To run those factories, the government didn't just hire workers. It built cities to hold them, cities that did not officially exist. Oak Ridge, the site with the magnets and the borrowed silver, went from empty Tennessee farmland to a population of around 75,000 people in a matter of a few years. At its peak, it was the fifth largest city in the state, and you could not find it on a public map. It had schools, shops, churches, and cinemas. It had no name the outside world was allowed to know. Now here is the strange and human core of it. Almost none of those 75,000 people knew what they were making. The whole operation ran on compartmentalization, a deliberate architecture of ignorance. Each worker was told exactly enough to do their one task and not one sentence more. A young woman might sit at a control panel for months, watching a dial, told only to keep the needle inside a certain range and to call a supervisor if it drifted. She was, in fact, operating one of the atom sorting machines. No one told her that. The word uranium was effectively forbidden. Say it aloud and you could be quietly asked to leave. People worked for years, drew a paycheck for years, raised children in a town for years, and only understood what they had actually built on the morning in 1945 when the news said a single bomb had erased a city. And the sharpest illustration of that architecture has a name. The women who ran those atom sorting panels at Oak Ridge, later remembered as the Calutron Girls, were mostly local recruits, many of them fresh out of high school, hired precisely because they had no physics in their heads to get in the way. They were trained to hold a needle inside a range, and told nothing else. At one point, the scientist who had invented the machines, certain his PhDs could outproduce a room of untrained Tennessee girls, staged a friendly contest between the two groups. The girls won, and it wasn't close. The reason reads almost like a parable. The physicists couldn't stop themselves from chasing every flicker on the dials, adjusting constantly, so the machines never settled and never hit their stride. The young women simply followed the procedure and let the equipment run. Trained ignorance, it turned out, outproduced expert curiosity. One of them, Gladys Owens, watched her panel for months in 1945 without ever knowing what it did, and only understood the whole of it decades later. In 2004, when she returned as an old woman and recognized her own face in a famous photograph of the control room. She had helped enrich the uranium for a weapon, and she learned that fact, like nearly everyone else in the city, from the outside. Think about what that means as an economic structure. You have, at the peak of the whole effort, something like 130,000 people employed across the project. A workforce the size of a large city, drawing wages, buying groceries, doing skilled and unskilled labor, all pouring their days into a product that most of them were structurally prevented from naming. The secrecy wasn't a side effect, it was a line item. It costs money to build the fences, run the security, screen the workers, and maintain an entire population inside a story that wasn't true. And I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make these people sound like dupes. They were not. They were doing real, difficult, often tedious work under enormous pressure, inside a system engineered specifically so that no single one of them could see the whole. That's not foolishness. That's design. The genius of the Manhattan Project, if you want to find genius in it, is less in the physics and more in this. It managed to buy the coordinated labor of over 100,000 people toward a single secret aim and keep the aim secret from the people themselves. That is not a science achievement. That is an economic and organizational one. And it costs exactly what you'd expect an achievement that size to cost. Let's total it up. Because the numbers, laid side by side, tell a story sharper than any single one of them. By 1945, the Manhattan Project had cost roughly $2.2 billion in the money of the day. Translate that into today's terms, and you're somewhere around $30 billion. An enormous sum, the kind of number you'd expect for a war-ending superweapon. But now do the thing almost no one does. Break the invoice apart, and look at where the lines actually fall. The uranium operation at Oak Ridge, the magnets, the silver, the sorting accounts for the largest single share, well over half of everything. The plutonium operation at Hanford takes the next great slice. Between them, the two material factories swallow around 80 cents of every dollar. And the laboratory at Los Alamos, the desert lab, the chalkboards, the brilliant men, the part every film is about, the place where the bomb was actually designed, comes to roughly 4% of the total. 4%! Say it slowly, because it inverts the entire story we tell. The part we remember, the genius, the design, the weapon itself, is close to a rounding error. The part we forget, the mines, the plants, the metal, the secret cities, is essentially the whole bill. We built a $30 billion supply chain in order to feed a laboratory that cost about $1 billion, so that the laboratory could produce a device whose raw materials had already consumed everything else. Put it another way, the most famous, most celebrated work in the entire enterprise was, in pure budget terms, the tip you leave at the end of an enormous meal. The weapon was the afterthought. The supply chain was the war. And this is the drumbeat I want you to carry out of this video, because it's true of every nuclear weapon ever made, not just the first ones. The hard part is never the bomb. The hard part is the industrial capacity standing behind the bomb, the ability to produce the fuel, which means the ability to build and run the factories, which means the ability to spend colossal sums for years on something that might not work, with nothing to show along the way. The device at the end is real, but it is the cheapest, smallest, last thing in a chain of things, almost all of which are invisible, which raises the question the invoice can't answer on its own. If the knowledge was public, and the design was the cheap part, then what was the United States actually buying with all that money? What did those billions purchase that another country's chalkboard couldn't? The answer is the most valuable thing in this entire story. And it isn't a bomb. Here's where we double back and reclaim the story we threw out. We started by saying the genius version of the bomb is a lie of proportion, that crediting brilliance ignores the factory. And that's true. But now that you've seen the factory, let me hand a piece of the credit back, because the honest picture needs it. America did build the bomb first. That's not nothing, and it wasn't luck. But the thing that put America first was not that its physicists were smarter than everyone else's. Remember, the physics was shared. The chalkboards were global. What America had that no rival could match in time was the economy to act on the physics. The uninterrupted industrial base, the electricity, the silver in the vault, the ability to write a $2 billion check for a maybe in the middle of a war and absorb the risk if the whole thing failed. So the genius was real, but it was industrial genius, not theoretical genius. The decisive brilliance was in logistics, in mobilization, in the sheer capacity to convert money into infrastructure faster than anyone else on the planet. Read that way. The character judgment survives America was exceptional here, but it survives rooted in material fact instead of floating on a myth. The exceptional thing was the economy, not the equations. And I want to be intellectually honest about the edges of this claim, because the neat version is too neat. Historians still argue about exactly how close Germany, Japan, or the Soviet Union really were, and about how much of the American lead came from resources versus talent, refugees, espionage, and plain circumstance. I can't hand you a clean percentage, and anyone who does is selling certainty that the evidence doesn't support. But here's what the evidence does clearly support, and it's the part that matters. The barrier to the bomb was never mainly a barrier of knowing. It was a barrier of building, and a barrier of building is, at bottom, a barrier of paying. That single correction changes how you read the entire nuclear age that followed. It explains why, for years, the bomb belonged only to the largest and richest states on Earth, not because only they could understand it, but because only they could afford the hidden economy underneath it. The secret that actually spread, slowly and dangerously, over the following decades wasn't really the idea. It was the industrial recipe, the know-how to build the factories, to enrich the material, to do the expensive, unglamorous middle of the sentence. The idea was never the fence. The economy was the fence. You can watch that logic play out in the years right after. When the Soviet Union produced its own bomb in 1949 sooner than most Western predictions, it didn't do it by uncovering some hidden equation the Americans had kept. It did it by building its own version of the same hidden economy. Its own secret cities, its own enrichment plants, its own enormous diversion of a war-shattered budget. Espionage sped it up, no question. But stolen blueprints still can't be eaten by a reactor. Even with the recipe in hand, a country still had to be able to afford the kitchen, and for a long time, only a very few could. Which brings us, finally, to the strangest line on the whole invoice, the one that never stops being charged. Here is the paradox that sits at the center of everything we've traced. A government spends billions, spends a mine, a power grid, a treasury's worth of silver, the secret labor of 100,000 people to build a weapon. And then, if everything goes to plan, the weapon does absolutely nothing. Forever. It sits in a silo or a bunker, maintained, guarded, updated, and never used. Success for a nuclear weapon is a lifetime of doing nothing. So what, exactly, did all that money buy? It didn't buy an explosion. The whole point is that the explosion never comes. It bought something far more abstract and far more expensive to maintain. It bought belief. The entire economic value of a nuclear weapon lives in one thing: the credibility of the idea that it could go off. You are not paying for the detonation. You are paying to make an adversary certain, in their bones, that the detonation is real and possible and pointed at them. The bomb's job is not to be used. Its job is to be believed. And belief, it turns out, is not a one-time purchase. It's a subscription, and the bill never stops arriving. A weapon that might work is worthless. The enemy has to know it works, which means it must be tested, maintained, modernized, guarded, and replaced as it ages, decade after decade. Add all of that up, not just the building, but the believing, sustained across 2 generations, and the numbers leave the Manhattan Project looking almost quaint. One accounting of the total United States nuclear weapons enterprise, from 1940 through 1996, put the cost at roughly $5.5 trillion. Not the bomb, the belief bought and rebought every year for half a century. And that meter did not stop when the Cold War did. It's still running as you watch this. Recent projections put the cost of simply operating and modernizing the current American arsenal at roughly $750 billion across a single decade, on the order of $75 billion a year. Now, just to keep the belief credible, no new war, no new weapons strictly needed, just the standing cost of remaining believable, a bill your own generation is quietly paying in real time, mostly without ever noticing the line item. Let me try 2 comparisons, and let me be honest about where each one breaks. The first is insurance. In a way, a nuclear arsenal is a premium a country pays against a catastrophe it hopes never to file a claim on. That captures the pay forever, use never part well. But it breaks down at the crucial point. Ordinary insurance pays you when disaster strikes. This insurance only pays out inside the very catastrophe it exists to prevent. The one moment it's used is the moment it has already failed at its real job. The second is a brand. A country spends fortunes to make the world believe something about it, and the value lives entirely in other people's heads. That's closer deterrence really is a reputation you're buying. But a brand wants to be experienced. You want people to actually use the product. This is a reputation whose entire worth depends on the product never being experienced by anyone, ever. It's the strangest brand on earth, one that dies the instant it delivers. Now the one this channel always comes back to. Follow the money all the way down and ask who actually bears the cost of that belief. Because it is never the people making the decision. It's the taxpayer who funds an arsenal they will never see and were never really consulted about. It's the communities downwind of the test ranges who breathed the fallout from proving the weapons worked. It's the land and water around the material plants, places like Hanford, where the cost of making plutonium is still being cleaned up, at public expense, generations later, an invoice that keeps arriving long after the weapons it paid for were retired. And in the first and only cases where the belief was ever cashed in, it was the people beneath the two cities who had no voice in the transaction at all, and who paid the entire price of proving that the thing was real. The weapon's whole value is a belief held by powerful people. The cost of manufacturing that belief has always been paid by someone else. So let's go back to where we started, to the invoice. We began with a claim that sounded wrong, that an atomic bomb is not an expensive bomb. And now you can see why it's true. The device is the cheap part. The materials are most of the bill. The factories and the secret cities are most of the materials. And sitting on top of all of it, dwarfing every physical thing, is the one item you can't hold, can't photograph, and can't ever stop paying for the credibility of a threat that only works if it's never used. That's the real product. Not the flash. The belief. It's why the last question you should ever ask about a nuclear weapon is how do you build one? Building one, in the end, is just money and time, and a willingness to spend both on something monstrous. The deeper question, the economic one, the honest one, is what does it cost to be believed, and who ends up paying that cost while someone else holds the power? So the next time a country is said to have gotten the bomb, notice what your mind does. It pictures the object, the sphere, the flash, the thing on the table. Try to picture the sentence instead. Picture the mine, and the power plant, and the borrowed silver, and the city with no name, and the 100,000 people who never knew, and the 50 years of quiet payments still to come. The bomb was only ever the last word. Everything that matters was in the sentence before it.